Clarkville. This is Exhibit B. Just want to say a couple of quick things. Thank you for being here. This is a collaborative art studio run by about 14 or 15 artists, and we keep it alive through your support and just the generosity of artists around Seattle. And we can do these amazing things, and what this is right now is a grouping of about 70 different writers from around the country. We've brought them into the space. All the books and all the artwork that's on the wall right now is representative of this particular series, and we've actually put all that work together into a book that we've created. It's over there, you can take a look at it. It's for sale, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So that is where we're at right now. And please make yourself at home. The bathroom's in the back, the bar's right there. Please feel comfortable and be free to do whatever you want in here. This is a community space, so we want you to feel like you're part of the community. Also, I want to make sure that we remember and recognize that we're on unceded Duwamish land right now, and if you're not from Seattle, it's wise to, and it would be lovely to take a look into what that means and the status of the tribe right now, and keep that in mind as we're moving through the city. And now I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Thank you. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to Tim and to Common AREA Maintenace for hosting this event and making this such a wonderful space to give our presentation. So this is a panel titled "An Absence of Caution: Taking Risks Against Aesthetic Convention." So we are a number of writers and teachers and translators, and we are going to talk to you about kind of what taking risks means for us and the work that we do. I will be giving a brief introduction of our panelists, reading their bios in the order in which they will read their work and present what they have to say. Each of us will have about 5 minutes to give a short talk, and then it'll kind of open up into more of a conversation, and then there'll be room for questions with the audience kind of opening up that conversation toward the end. So first presenting, we have, J. Howard Rozier is the New Books columnist at Vulture. His writing has appeared in Book Forum, The Nation, Art in America, Freeze, 4 Columns, Poetry, and Elsewhere. He is a board member of the National Book Critics Circle and a lecturer at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Reading second, we have Isadora Angel. And Isadora is the author of 2 book-length translations from Bulgarian and a 2023 NEA Translation Fellow. Her writing has appeared in Astra Magazine, Electric Literature, Chicago Reader, Words Without Borders, and elsewhere. Isadora is at work on Solomon's Daughter, a memoir, and she is a founding member of the Third Coast Translators Collective. Reading next will be Sam Heaps. Sam is a genderqueer writer, organizer, and visual artist with an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Heaps' debut essay collection, Proximity, is forthcoming and now available? Yes, now available. Big clap for Sam. And Sam will be, I believe, at the Clash Books table on Saturday. So that's exciting. Sam has received support from Tin House, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the NES Artist Residency. Heaps teaches writing at the University of Arts in Philadelphia and is currently seeking representation for a novella about Mormonism, climate anxiety, and attachment. So, look out for that. We will also be hearing from Shailin Mishra, and Shailin is a visiting assistant professor at Swarthmore College. His works have appeared or are forthcoming at Diagram, the Baltimore Review, the Bookends Review, and elsewhere. His research interests include constraint-based writing, multimodal narrative, narrative empathy, and writing studies. I forgot to mention myself. My name is Ryan Clark. I will be actually presenting third, so forgive me. I write poetry through a unique method of homophonic translation, and I'm the author of the books Arizona SB 1070 and ACT, which is available over there, by the way, and How I Pitched the First Curve, My poems have appeared in such journals as Diagram, Painted Bride Quarterly, and Yemassee. I teach at Waldorf University as an associate professor of English and creative writing. So we'll get started today with J. Howard Roach.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Cam. This is awesome. Glad to be here. When I arrived at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for my MFA, the pervading narrative was privilege. That is, where one's background situated them within the broader, and in this case, academic power structure. I'm sensitive to this position, but in aggregate it strikes me as a narcissism of petty differences. In order to operate within elite spaces, either one is privileged or privileged enough to take the risk. Overtly, this means loans and time off of the jobs market, but there's also a chance taken in the aesthetic sense. Can you afford to believe nothing matters but the work at hand? If you come from poverty or close to it, can you afford not to take the advice of professors or advisors to commercialize your work? Can you devote time toward book reviewing or long-form criticism at the expense of jobs with more earning potential or more opportunities to get your book published? Much of the success in writing hinges on whether you are able to negotiate what is most important to your growth, or whether there is a risk to prioritizing one discipline over another, if for no other reason than you'll be associated with it forever. Then in order to move more laterally within the publishing industry will be construed as risky. My own experience with ambition, or the idea of it, is what brought me to this talk. With no teaching experience, I managed to snag 2 prestigious teaching fellowships while completing my master's, one teaching liberal arts, and another as a teaching assistant for the BFA thesis course. For the latter, what on earth could I teach a writing student about finishing a project when I hadn't finished mine? For the former, how does teaching English help students how does teaching English to students help my own writing? There are answers in the affirmative to both, but the main point I'm trying to illustrate is a tension between writing as a practice and writing as a career. Anything that takes away from your writing is considered a hindrance, but writing as an act isn't enough to get you a job. What is risky, existentially, is in the real world hedging, risk adverse. I took a risk asking the faculty advisor at FNUS to let me be an arts editor. I knew what I thought about visual art because I enjoyed it. Plus all the magazines I read didn't differentiate issues of art, literature, and politics. Everything was culture, to be discussed by anyone with the courage to think deeply about it. Not so, I was told. Without experience, I had to prove that I was capable of understanding it. Thus, a risky year writing about art to satiate someone who didn't want to risk the paper's reputation on me. It paid off, though. In my second year, I was editing the art section for the school paper of one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. Except that I went into SAC to work on fiction, not journalism, which is a roundabout way of saying that rewards can come from not taking risks as well. This fork in the road continued upon graduation. Most people would be happy with one fellowship exiting an MFA program. I got 3. One from the writing department, one from the graduate division, and one from the National Book Critics Circle, where I now serve on the board. I find myself around writers and publishers often, and I've managed to land some pieces I am proud of at prominent outlets, but I can't escape the feeling that this all stems from not taking the risk of saying no to money or attention or the pressures of the industry while getting my novel done. I don't mean to scare anyone away from the profession that I've dedicated my life to. I just want to emphasize that trusting oneself, doing what feels right for oneself in the moment, and being proud of one's accomplishments, there's a risk to that too. Since the genesis of this was a pedagogy talk, I'll conclude by raising 3 concepts of discussion for the group. Attentive risk. In A.S. Hammer's Let's Go to Paris, the film critic discusses the work of Sofia Coppola without really talking about the films at all. Much of the attention goes toward the workings of the French royal court, the Trumps, and Breakfast at Tiffany's. That is, previous iterations of wealth and corruption. Hammer uses real-world examples to defend Coppola's penchant for surface-level storytelling. There is nothing deeper to the aesthetics, because there is nothing deeper to the people. Hammer resists the trappings of Hollywood reviewing, its name-dropping, and cursory plot summaries. Where one chooses to spend one's time is a moral choice, and Hammer risks diminishing the film's accomplishments by justifying them on non-formalist grounds. Structural risk. Now, Molly Serpell's Black Hole begins with the phrase genital flap and ends with the author's finger sliding across the black screen of her iPhone as a personification of female masturbation. When I ask my students what it's about, I usually get something along the lines of the internet being a space that both devalues and is driven by black female sexuality. When I propose that it is actually about the internet, the room falls silent. The brilliance of the essay has nothing to do with the subject at all, though it is indeed browsing. Serpell creates a facsimile of an internet rabbit hole in what is an otherwise traditional essay by dirtying up her transitions and quickening her pace. Her subject and structure create a bait and switch, where the risk of speaking frankly about black sexuality obfuscates the risk of creating something that feels like the medium it is discussing. Theoretical risk. In Christian Loretzen's Vying Animal, a review of Blake Bailey's biography of the late Philip Roth, the primary motive in American literature is careerism, with writers both managing their public images and working on their books. Assimilationist, yet deeply interested in the life of Jewish Americans, philandering, yet protective of his portrayals of women in his novels as art, prized by the literary community, but not enough to win the Nobel Prize. In many ways, Roth is the crown jewel of careerless writers. But Loretzen's risk is showing the literary world, or at least the pervading idea of the literary world, to itself. An exquisitely managed career, right down to this totemic and compulsively readable biography, which young writers are well advised to consult as a blueprint for enduring literary stardom, Loretzen writes. Its lessons include never marry, have no children, lawyer up early, keep tight control of your cover designs, listen to the critics while scorning them publicly. When it comes to publishers, follow the money. Never give a minute to a hostile interviewer. Avoid unflattering photographers. Figure out what you're good at and keep doing it, book after book, with just enough variation to keep them guessing. Sell out your friends, sell out your family, sell out your lovers, and sell out yourself. Keep going until every younger writer can be called your imitator. Don't stop until all your enemies are dead. Thank you.
So next up we'll have Isadora Angel, and I will ask a question to kind of kickstart her talk here. So Isadora, you translate from Bulgarian, a language which experiences negative growth on an almost yearly basis. What does risk-taking look like for you in bringing Bulgarian literature over into English? And what are you putting on the line?
Thank you, and that was really great. Yeah, so Bulgaria is like a tiny country, the size of Tennessee, and it's after the fall of communism in the early 90s, there's over 1 million Bulgarians that left the country, so Bulgaria became sort of very good at exporting Bulgarians, and if not much else. And so what happens when you have that many people leaving is that the language atrophies, and if we think of a language as a living, breathing thing, and if we think of language as an ecosystem, and it's a species, and the way we would sort of look at how to avoid a species going extinct is the way we can look at the way languages can be endangered. And the Bulgarian is not quite endangered, but it is losing numbers, every year, because less and less new people are learning it. And so what I do when I translate from the Bulgarian is I attempt to somehow create a conversation and create a dialogue between this little minority language and the English-speaking world. And I don't know if that preserves things in the long run, but it makes me feel like it's doing something. And the Bulgarian has a very long tradition of oral storytelling because Bulgaria was under Ottoman subjugation for 500 years, and the language was, you couldn't, literature was essentially forbidden, so you couldn't write it and read it. It had to be sort of just spoken. And so that created a storytelling tradition which is still very much present in the writing of the literature. And so I was born in Bulgaria. I immigrated from there to the US, so I have both of these languages. I never studied translation, I never studied writing, but I knew that I wanted to write, and so I did. I started sort of writing, and every single writing job that I have gotten has been the result of a cold email to an editor. And, I guess you could say that there's satisfaction in that no phone calls were ever made on my behalf, although it would have fucking saved some time, you know what I mean? But I have to say, it's sort of, you have both languages and you want to write and you do write, and that doesn't necessarily lead to translation, though I was dabbling in it a little bit, and I realized, my God, it's not even enough to have both languages and to want to write and to write. There's even more above that. And but I guess what created this kind of insurmountable urgency for me to be a translator was one day a few years ago, maybe six or 8 years ago now at this point. I was reading the New York Times, the Sunday Book Review, and there was an interview with the preeminent poet and translator Clive James, and he was promoting his newest translation of Dante's Inferno, because we need, more of those, right? There's not enough. There's not enough of those. And he was being interviewed for the By the Book interview series, which is basically you're asking a writer the same questions every week. And they asked him, which felt kind of like a throwaway question. They asked him, what's the funniest book you've ever read? And he goes, Lucky Jim by Kingsley Amis. And then completely unprompted, he follows that up by saying, is there a Bulgarian equivalent languishing somewhere, untranslated? Probably not. And I was like, holy shit, you take a swipe at this minority, underdog language in the paper of record for no reason. And I'm like, okay, well, there's 3 of us in the world that can translate from Bulgarian into English that, it felt like the calling was there, and the reason I sort of share this experience is because that's how it has felt for this journey ever since then, ever since I decided, okay, I'm going to sort of mimic my physical migration from Bulgaria to America with this literary migration, every word I translate, it's like immigrating all over again. Every book that I translate is like an immigrant, coming into this country. Every book that gets rejected feels like somebody being turned away. And of course, the reasons publishers give you is well, it's, it's just doesn't, it's too different, or they won't say it's too different, but they'll say it's underdeveloped, or it's, it's not quite, not quite what we're looking for, And so I translated two books already, and they each one has created its own sort of journey, and in doing this translation, I sort of zeroed in on the thing. So there's 20 books that have been translated from Bulgarian in the history of the world. Out of those, 5 maybe are by Bulgarian women, right? So you have this sort of tiny, tiny little thing that you're working with, but it feels like a big mission. And this latest book that I'm translating, it's a collection of short stories. It's like flash fiction, women-centric, sort of almost folkloric kind of stuff. And I've been working on the stories for 2 years. And this year I was awarded a National Endowment for the Arts grant for it, which felt like something. Yeah. Thank you. it felt like everything that I had put on the line, like income, professional sort of relationships I've put on the line because I refuse to get, paid in pennies, fighting with publishers on, to have your name on the cover, which you should because, that's every word in there, you picked it, it's a collaboration with the author, and fighting things like the translator's name on the cover can only be, 60% of the size of the author's name and things like that. And I just wanted to read, so I'm sending this collection out to publishers, and everyone's like, no, it just doesn't fit, it doesn't, this feels, underdeveloped or, it feels like every story has to have an aha moment at the end, and then I just received the NEA panel feedback, and it was a completely different thing. And what they said is, this is a captivating selection of microfiction that reflects the compression and lyricism of poetry and the intuitive narrative structures of storytelling in oral folklore. Both the source text and the translation seem exceptional, conveying the poetic core of homespun mythologies that grow in all families to different degrees. So, how can it be that on one side you have people saying that it's weird or undeveloped or whatever, and then the other side you have this, right? And so this is what gives me fuel, and this is what sort of makes the risk of dedicating a substantial part of your life of losing out on income, what you were saying before. Because we can, all of us can make six figures doing something else. But you choose sort of the mission you just choose what you feel is important, and if you're lucky enough to sort of be able to pursue it, then it's all worth it. So, what I want to say for anybody struggling, I questioned myself, I questioned my talent, I questioned the material, I questioned everything. It felt like a fool's errand to try to bring this Bulgarian into English, but if you create community, if you find like-minded people, if you find allies, things will reveal themselves. So, yeah.
So Isadora, listening to you talking about, especially whether or not the risk was worth it, felt so similar in a very different way, but to my own kind of artistic journey. I decided to write this really weird kind of writing called homophonic translation. Has anyone heard of that? There you go. So it's part of what I'm going to talk about here. So I'm talking about hybrid forms as a means of fostering risk-taking, specifically in the creative writing classroom. And homophonic translation is kind of how I found myself within that, but as a teacher, it kind of took a different shape. So as a writer and as a teacher, I tend to focus on long-term goals, as this allows me to better manage the many, many failures I experience along the way. Among my guiding principles is the idea from Pierre Doris that poetry is a nomadic pursuit, that it is always on the way and never settled, never truly arrived. There is no perfect poem, no perfect pedagogy. There is only a direction to pursue and the expectation that I will stumble along this path, maybe just a little, but probably a lot, and that by opening myself up to what is possible as opposed to what is known, what is risky as opposed to what is safe, I will find myself more fulfilled as an artist and as a teacher in knowing that I am reaching forward toward what might be instead of what already has been. This has held true for me since the spring of 2007 when I enrolled in a hybrid forms workshop as an MFA student at Naropa University. The course was taught by the poet Michelle Naka-Pierce, and her charge was straightforward. Take something that isn't traditionally seen as a poem and make it a poem. For my project, I decided to take a grammar handbook, Andrea Lunsford's The Everyday Writer, and transform the text into something else using homophonic translation. For those who don't know, homophonic translation involves rewriting a text based on each individual letter's ability to produce different sounds. This is something I was into kind of growing up, just making puns out of everything basically, but this is like punning on overdrive. So one example of my early homophonic translations from this project was turning the word verbs into of her bees, which is absolutely awful, nonsensical, and I only marginally improved as the semester continued. But I enjoyed it, and it felt right to me. Here was this opportunity to do something unique, and I was all in. For the next 4 years, I continued to practice and hone my method of homophonic translation, studying linguistics and writing a lot of bad poetry. By year 5, I discovered that the word cat could be translated into more than 65 different words or phrases, just by thinking about the different sounds that C, A, and T can make. Some examples include cod, Kate, catch, shot, ash, and many more. And I progressed enough in my skill with homophonic translation to be able to make good poetry. At the time, I wrote what would become my first 2 books using this method: How I Pitched the First Curve, which translated an old article about baseball, about the invention of the curveball, into a 10-part poem that explored different social issues within the history of baseball. And Arizona SB 1070, an act, which was a rejection and rewriting of the 2010 anti-immigration bill of the same name, and that book actually is available over there. All of this was because a hybrid forms workshop allowed me the space as a poet to do something different, instead of simply being told how to better fit my writing to the tried and true safety of market-approved technique. In spring 2022, 15 years after I took a hybrid forms class as a student, I was able to teach my own hybrid forms workshop at Waldorf University. In organizing the course, I sought to emphasize experimental messiness over polished neatness, in-betweenness over adherence to form, and Joan Retallack's concept of the wager over safety. We read from a number of model texts, including a few that are among the books included in that little reading nook. Assignments involved a series of one-off experiments wherein students were required to bring in a hybrid piece for workshop that aligned with particular generic modes, such as a hybrid poem, hybrid short story, etc. And at the end of the semester, students were tasked with turning in a final hybrid project, whether that be one longer work or thematically linked series of shorter pieces. Early on in the semester, I had students read the chapbook, Your Arkansas, A Strategy Guide, by NES Artist, which is a sort of memoir written as a video game strategy guide. To give you a brief taste, in the section labeled Meet the Blonde-Haired Boy, we are told the following. Meet the blonde-haired boy at the waffle press for +3 intelligence and 12-ounce styrofoam cups full of Tropicana, no pulp. Meet that blonde-haired boy at the waffle press. He'll tell you who he's been and who he will be, and he's always right. Students loved the idea of writing memoir as a strategy guide, so we tried to understand what about Artist's piece seemed to work so well, eventually landing on the idea that he had correctly identified the intersection between 2 genres. Strategy guides are essentially second-person narratives. And so by telling his own story as a second-person narrative, Artist was able to utilize the strategy guide form to instill a sense of fatalist eventuality into his story, while also allowing his story to serve as a series of helpful tips to others in similar life situations. After identifying what made the model text work, the class decided to try its hand at its own second-person memoir using the genre of instructional signs. Like strategy guides, signs are designed to tell you what to do, and so the class felt that perhaps it might work just as well as a borrowed form. The result of this experiment is the piece titled Pool Rules, which can be found placarded onto that little pillar. The piece was collaboratively written, with each of us writing a brief anecdote we remembered from an experience at a pool. We then changed each anecdote to second person and arranged them into a loose chronological narrative. If Pool Rules succeeds as literature, it does so by using the second person narrative of signs and contrasting the expectation of brief abstract commands with specific and concrete moments explaining how to use the pool according to the speaker's experience. There are many rich examples I could describe from this class, ranging from an activity book for the end of the world, wherein the reader completes a series of word puzzles and games as a means of co-creating a narrative of the apocalypse, to a breakup told through formal business correspondence, complete with itemized receipts, and even a horror story written in the form of an online recipe, another second-person narrative. Ultimately, what I saw throughout the course was a group of students engaging with possibility and renewing their sense of what their writing might become. I won't know for some time if the class will have as great an impact on my students as the hybrid forms class I took had on me, but I can already see 1 year later a great deal of evidence to suggest that a few of them have continued to take more risks in their work and identify what in their writing excites and fuels them. Thank you. And next we'll have Sam Heaps.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's already presented. I'm so excited to hear more, actually. I want to take this in two parts, and it's going to be a little more casual. So thank you. But I am an educator and a writer. Obviously, most of us are, and so I kind of want to take it in the first half, talking about teaching and pedagogy, which was originally what this panel was about, and how to foster risk in the classroom. And then also I wrote a sex memoir, and I'll talk about how that's connected. and yeah. So first, first of all, I'm an adjunct professor, which most people know is a pretty precarious position to be in. You don't make a lot of money. You don't know when you're going to get classes. You teach. Last semester I taught 8 classes at 3 different universities, and this semester I'm teaching 1 class at 1 university. So it's it can vary quite. We're talking about real life ramifications of what this field. I'm very nervous also. what this can do to you. That really challenges how you can plan ahead for your life. I don't have a partner. This is my income. So talking about risk in academia, I think, is part of talking about risk in writing, and that kind of feeds into my second job, which is a union organizer. And I actually think that a union organizer for faculty and grad students. And I actually think that ties in really well to what I talk about with my students, what I talk about with my work. I mean, obviously it's all connected, but really all organizing work is just how do people respond to fear? And how do you talk to people about fear? And how do you how do you get them to see that there is something bigger? I think Ryan said something that hasn't been before was something that you're talking about. And how can you help cultivate that in people and inspire them to see that rather than just cave in the face of fear, which is what I have to do, or what I'm trying not to do right now. And so that's something I want to talk about in this conversation, and how that shows up in the classroom as well. So I think grades are really bullshit. I was a very bad student, probably pretty evidently, and 1.7 GPA in high school, dropped out of college 3 times, very, very lucky I got into SAIC, and very happy to be on the other side of the classroom where I have implemented a policy of I don't grade them, and I tell them this very early in the semester. I tell them they're going to get an A if they show up and are kind to one another and help me cultivate some level of community within the classroom. And we talk about what that means, and we create oh, thank you. And we create a contract together, and we talk about what rules of standards of behavior might be for us, what we want to get out of the experience, and it's actually been incredibly fruitful, and I've had better attendance policy, I've had more assignments turned in on time with this policy of not trying to motivate through fear, and instead trying to motivate through hope for the future, which is something I teach a lot of classes on utopias and dystopias as well, so it's, but anyway, so that's kind of something that I'm thinking about and interested in, and also talking about kind of what we were talking about with different levels of privileges and what that brings to risk-taking. I taught last semester at a private art school and a community college and a what is Arcadia? A mainline rich kid college. Thank you. Very different student populations, very different understandings of what risk meant to them, and it showed up in their work in very different ways. And so trying to think about what, and not always what you would expect. I'm not sure how to fully articulate this, but trying to think about like who, obviously like what you're bringing to, sorry, people's cameras are on me now, and I'm nervous. I'm so sorry. But like thinking about, and I'm gonna stop doing that. But like trying to think about like how you can address different populations' concerns around risk, and like what your specific concerns about risk based on your history are. And so that's like kind of teaching is what I'm thinking about. And then pulling into that fear is like, yeah, I primarily consider myself to be a fiction writer, and I had a really interesting conversation last night with a genius writer named Kimberly King Parsons. If you haven't read her book, Blacklight, I really recommend it. But she was asking, because we did a workshop together in 2017, which was a fiction workshop, and she was asking, and my book is a sex memoir, and it looks like it, and she was asking me why I made this change to memoir, and if I felt more vulnerable in memoir, and like what that I got out of that. And I was like, yes, I absolutely feel more vulnerable in memoir. And kind of thinking about the risk taking of like the real lived risk of taking your life and taking the most vulnerable elements of your life, like like my 15-year-old sexual assault, or or the fact that I am still hung up on my ex-boyfriend. Like there are so many like very, very small little like gushy pink truths that I cannot hide behind a character. I cannot like fold into a well-crafted plot. And I have to stand behind and feel like it's art, and it's not just. I think a lot about the difference between writing as communication and writing as art, and something woo-woo or spiritual happens, and it is art, and that memoir feels like art, and trying to navigate that and what that risk means. And I think, that's something I'm interested in talking about as well, and I think I'll pass it on at that. Thank you.
And then Shaylin Mishra.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks. I'm the last one here. So thank you, Ken, for organizing this and giving us this space to talk about risk. So my example is particularly a pedagogic example. So kind of continues what Ryan and Sam have started talking about. So my example comes from Swarthmore College, where I taught last semester a course on style. So Swarthmore is a small liberal arts college near Philadelphia. So this was a course on style, and we were, as a class, thinking about how to develop our own personal style. And one idea that I definitely foregrounded is that you when you're thinking about developing your personal style, you also need to think that risk is going to be a factor into that, and how you take risk, how you understand risk, how you understand the consequences of risk is going to be important into your journey into developing a sense of style. So, with that being said, the example that so there are different modes of aesthetics we sort of thought about, but one particular example that I sort of shared with the students was that has to do with melodrama. So melodrama as a mode of writing has a bad rap to it. We don't consider that as a mode of aesthetics anymore. So the melodrama now gets to be used as an epithet when the writing is bad. But melodrama actually has a much more complicated history to it, and it is actually a legitimate mode of aesthetics. So the particular example that I shared with the class is Arundhati Roy's writing essay, End of Imagination, which she wrote in 1998 after India and Pakistan back to back, they detonated a nuclear bomb in this sort of a hubris of brinkmanship and sort of trying to get into this elite nuclear club. So it sort of brought a lot of despair and rage to Arundhati Roy, and she did not hold back. And she wrote in this End of Imagination in a style which will end up becoming a very characteristic style of hers, that full of rage, not holding back. So many critique then started to sort of call out Arundhati Roy's writing as polemical. And not that sense that polemics as a genre, but polemic as in a pejorative sense. But then as a fiction writer, so she just recently published, not recently, like a couple of years back, published her second novel. Her first novel was in the late 90s that came out, The God of Small Things, which won the Booker Prize. Even for that book's, one of the estimation of the critique was this is a melodramatic fiction. So, and melodrama is actually has a history to it, how that word has gotten used by critiques. Toni Morrison's work has been characterized sometimes as melodramatic. Alexander Chee's work has been characterized as melodramatic. Bharati Mukherjee's work has been characterized as melodramatic. So Torsha Ghoshal, who's a scholar who actually has been one of the inspiration for me to think about this idea of melodrama, she wrote in this a very perceptive essay which is titled, let me try to get the title right, Literary Imperialism and Scenes of High Melodrama. So in this essay, she talks about that the word melodrama has a pattern to it, how that gets used. It's usually gets to be used against writers of colors or queer writers, against their writing. This word gets used very often, and especially by the critiques who hold the high art, the high literary art, as sort of a standard sort of yardstick against which they measure something, and they sometimes call writing of people of color or writing of queer writers as melodramatic. And she says this pattern is problematic, and again, because of lack of time, I'm not able to get into that. But melodrama as a terminology has actually a much more richer history to it, and it is not all in negative connotation, because Peter Brooks, in his influential work, Melodramatic Imagination, identifies melodrama as a very useful aesthetics in the work of Balzac and in the work of Henry James. And recently, scholars such as Christine Gledhill and Linda Williams, and they have sort of injected necessary course correction to Peter Brooks' theory of melodrama, and also to add a more sort of cross-cultural perspective to melodrama. So melodrama as an aesthetic mode has got a lot to do with a mode of excess. So as Bharati Mukherjee calls that, I have a large story to tell. So don't find fault in my writing because I have an excess story to tell. So think about this, like for a writer to be operating from margins, for a writer to be operating from a side of oppression, they naturally have a lot of things to say. So there is a mode of excess to begin with. Exigency is already there. So naturally then the aesthetic manifests in a mode of excess. It seems very organic. So melodrama then as a mode of excess is not necessarily a bad way to sort of understand melodrama. So there are two complications here. So melodrama as a mode of excess, when we start to think about that, excess against what? So for that idea of excess is not a static or a stable notion. So across culture, what counts as excess is different. For an Indian audience, a song in the movie, like which we, from a Western vantage point or from a Western perspective, we watch a Bollywood movie, we see a song and dance number that has nothing to do with plot, we're like, that's excess. That is melodrama. But from an Indian audience's viewer standpoint, that is very much part of the plot. There is nothing extraneous about that. So there is a lot of sort of theory, like, when certain Western movies, early Western movie, starts to go to the China, and a Chinese audience starts to see the movies, early American movies, their idea of what excess was in an American movie is the show of flesh. They thought there's just too much sort of exposure of flesh, human flesh, on the movie. And they consider that as gratuitous, they consider that as melodramatic, they consider that as excess. So the point is that what is excess is not a stable notion. So what counts as melodrama for one culture is not melodramatic for another culture. So with that being said, however, melodrama can still be understood as a mode of excess, but in a more productive and constructive sense. And the pedagogic example that I sort of talked about and we sort of wrestled as a class together, when we broke apart Arundhati Roy's writing to a language level, we started to see a lot of instances of repetition of language. So what then becomes melodrama is not something that is a errant or that is a uncontrolled outcome, but it ended up being a much more deliberate strategy on the part of writer to create a melodramatic effect, to create an excess sense of rage, anger, and emotion. So I have just one example that's up there, if you could see that, and if we can dim the lights a little bit, maybe this will pop up. Thank you. So just one excerpt from the End of Imagination article, essay there, and talking about the nuclear bomb. And there are certain formalist features that you can start to note, like the first sentence, end with missiles at Pakistan. Even Pakistan can't solve by pointing nuclear missiles at Pakistan. So there is anadiplosis, which is repetition of a word in quick succession. So a word that ends one sentence and begins again in the next sentence very quickly. So Pakistan, even Pakistan. Then we go to there we share sky, we share wind, we share water. Very sudden, excessive sort of repetition that is happening there. But again, that's rage, that's movement that we see. We share sky, we share winds, and there should be an and. We share water, but Roy drops the and, creating an ascendant effect. And what we have, like a parallelism that is going on there, or more like an isocolon, like a very strict sort of parallel. We share sky, 3 words. We share winds, 3 words. We share water, 3 words. And then there is, at the very last sentence, we see, if we bomb Lahore, Punjab will burn. If we bomb Karachi, then Gujarat and Rajasthan, perhaps even Bombay, will burn. Any nuclear war with Pakistan will be a war against ourselves. And that's a literary device called climax we see at play here. But it is a feature where you see a lot of repetition that is going on. And repetition is one way of seeing excess being at work. But to teach melodrama in this way, I feel like gives students a one way of understanding to how to build excess in the prose in a more deliberate and sort of thoughtful manner. And if we could just quickly go to the second page, and I won't get into detail about it, and I'm happy to sort of talk to you about it outside of this presentation. after this presentation. But yeah, there again you see different sort of features of literary devices that is getting used, but they are all adding up because there are different types of repetitions that is happening there. The point being that, again, our notion of what counts as melodrama doesn't have to be negative, but if we sort of can break it down as a sort of a learning moment for all of us as writers, we can start to see that it is a mode of risk. It is a mode of sort of trying to build an excess, but that excess seems to have a purpose to it, has a pattern to it, and has a way of building an engagement for the reader. Thank you.
So at this point of the program, we're going to open it up a little bit for more kind of conversation. And to kind of kick things off a little bit, I was struck by these passages that you shared, Shailen, because what you point out is something that I feel like in any workshop would be like crossed out and be like, no. And I think the origin of this panel was originally thinking about that workshop aesthetic and how neutralizing it is, and how just play it to the middle, and how crushing that can be for the creativity that we get into this for. And I like also what Sam said about trying not to make the motivation fear, because we have the motivation of fear of, oh, this isn't going to sell, so I can't publish it, or this is too out there, I'm not going to bring it into a workshop, or why go into translating Bulgarian? Like, all of these different things that I feel kind of push us away from taking these risks they're very heavy forces. And so I'm curious to hear from all of the rest of you all on the panel, what kind of keeps motivating you to take these kinds of risks in your work, and what pushes you through that negativity of people just saying no, or it's not good, or whatever it might be?
I'm gonna respond to that because I am trying to seek representation for a novella right now, which is really stupid. So I would like to comment on this. There is this I think it is doing honor to the work, and it's believing in yourself, but believing that there is something more powerful than capitalism, than the gatekeepers, yes or no, that is asking you to do this work. Yeah, and I think honoring that and honoring that impulse in yourself is what propels me to keep going. And I just wanted to say that. So thank you for asking that right now.
I was really struck. That's loud. Sorry. I was really struck by what Sam said about there is a difference between art and just writing, writing and just writing to put out there, and writing is art. I'm garbling that, but I really, because what I deal with often is there's reviewing and there's cultural essays, but for me, I never really learned the difference. An essay to me is a review and talking or thinking with the work, and so it's two minds kind of melding together, and the writing becomes an expression or articulation of the ideas present in the work. But oftentimes what reviewing is turned into is it's who, what, when, where, why, and then is it good or bad, and then you're just out in 500 words. You don't really learn anything about the book or the ideas, and so yeah, I'm all about art. Writing is art, not writing is a sales pitch.
I did have a train of thought going, but I kind of lost it.
Well, I can step in and respond to my own question. So, with this homophonic translation thing that I did, I originally wanted to do something right in a way that no one else was doing, and so I stumbled this homophonic translation thing. And as I said, the first few years were just writing a lot of bad poems. They were terrible, absolutely terrible. Like, if I were to read them now, you'd be like, what are you talking about? This is awful. Like, they made no sense. So the reason why my first book was about baseball was because I was inspired by the guy who pitched the first curveball. His name was Candy Cummings, and he was the first person to make a ball move. Not just go fast or go slow, but move. And he experimented for years with arm angles, ways of throwing, all of it. And he finally made it curve, and it was like this glorious moment for him. And I'm like, if he can do it, I can do it. So I just kept trying with this method, studying linguistics, studying all these things, and just kind of keep putting out bad poems until they became a little less bad, and I could get this meaning out of it. And it's like, okay, I can make it mean something, but it's still bad poetry. And then kind of continuing to work. And like for me, I would be doing this, or it's the only thing I want to do, I guess. So it took a long time to get like my first poem published. It took a long time to get a book published, and only because I have friends. Like, it's hard to do weird stuff and have it be successful. But I think what drives me is that this is what I want to do, and I'm just going to go full force into it, and hopefully, fingers crossed, other people will like it. That would be nice.
So yeah, it's back. I remember what I was trying to say. So I feel like the idea of rage is kind of a very underestimated idea in the creativity process, that how anger can be a constructive sort of force. Arundhati Roy embraces the idea of rage very unapologetically. And when like a level like melodrama, when it is used as a very negative sense, can definitely hurt your confidence as a writer. But like as Isadora that you sort of mentioned, like reading that interview was kind of a response that was filled with anger, and then just to prove that no, that this person is wrong, and not to let them sort of feel justified in what they're sort of saying and challenging that. I feel like it is a very, very important idea. And I feel like many of us are operating from a minority sort of at least I know that 5 of us, I know that from our background to some extent, I know that some of us are speaking from all of us are speaking from one way or another from a side that is not been been paid much attention to, or has been some kind of marginalized in some way, to try to prove that yes, we can speak up too, or we have a voice. I feel like is very important to me to know that how melodrama as a concept, because I have used that negatively all the time, but to know that how that word melodrama actually has a much more deeper history to it, and how it is a legitimately an aesthetic mode, has given me much more sort of confidence to think about that as or to practice that in my own writing. So yeah, to answer Ryan's questions about what gives you sort of energy to keep going, I feel like in the one way or another to prove somebody wrong. When you start to believe that no, that person is wrong, that perception is wrong, that idea is wrong, that you need to challenge that, can be a very, very sort of helpful device.
Mm.
So I have a question for Isadora here. So in particular, what sustains you in your endeavor to continue translating? Especially work that so often renders the very person doing the translation visible. As you were talking about, you have to fight to get your name on the cover. So what kind of sustains you in this kind of way of continuing to make these pushes?
I think fighting against the fear, I guess I'm lucky in a sense that, I grew up under communism. Like, both my grandfathers were destroyed by the regime, and my father was in prison twice, so like I'm not fucking scared of like this, right? So there's something that drives you because you've seen tragedy and you've seen injustice and you've seen people being silenced, and so I just refuse to be. I mean, my life's not threatened, right? My life's not in danger. I suppose if I'm killed, it's going to be kind of a metaphor, right? It's not an actual thing. So, but what sustains me is when you are able to sort of fight with, your own feelings of ineptitude or failure, or you find community, and community is what gives you life. It's other writers, it's other translators, it's, fellowships, it's residencies, and for instance, I applied to Bread Loaf a couple of years ago with the same project that I ended up winning the NEA with, and I applied, and in my application, I was just pissed off, I was just like, you know what? I don't get paid anything. It's so hard. You get rejected all the time. I'm like, I need that. I basically said in the application, I said if I'm close to giving up, like, because, and and I'm like, maybe that'll like come across as like urgent or whatever. I don't know. I mean, it wasn't acting, but I mean, it was just like, what do I have to lose? Because like all my applications are usually like very like articulate and making a case and everything, and I'm just, you know what, I'm just gonna like take a risk with it and just say, I'm close to just kind of giving up, and a few weeks after that I received a rejection letter. And they're like, sorry, we're full, or whatever. And then I wrote back, and I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I applied for the fully funded spot. Like, is that full? And a week later, they're like, oh, actually, we do have a spot for you. And your mentor is going to be Jennifer Croft, who translates like Olga Tokarczuk. And then I get into that, and then I get, and then she's so generous, Jenny, with the work, and it's just like, holy shit, and so you're just like, you just move through these extremes of like extreme rejection to like extreme acceptance, and it's just like, what do you believe? Is it crap or is it good? Is it as good as, they say, or is it as bad as it, and so you're just constantly defined by these external, forces. So that's why, it's good to have a contractually obligated spouse who has to read everything and tell you that it's really good, and that that's helpful.
So my next question I want to kind of pose to everybody, really. So we've talked about different structural forces that kind of are very discouraging, like as Dora just mentioned. So how are some ways that we can get younger writers, in particular, to really embrace risk and not give them the kinds of, I guess, boundaries or fences that we're kind of coming across ourselves? Sam, you mentioned, for instance, using a grading contract to just say, hey, look, if you do this stuff, you're fine. Has that been something that you found helps in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think, again, I also want to say that I don't often teach creative writing. I often teach freshman composition, which is a whole different bear of if we're talking about risk, we're talking about teaching them how to follow particular guidelines so that they will not, it's a kind of a different thing. Certainly the grading policy, I think, has really helped within my classroom, but then there's also, I think I was talking about what different student populations bring to each, to this, and I find that it's not surprisingly, but my community college students are the ones I find it's most difficult to encourage them to step outside the box. I think because they have, a lot of them are older students, a lot of them are they have a lot on the line personally, and they have a lot on the line to be in the classroom, and it's very difficult to ask them to do anything outside of the conventions of what is traditional MLA format or what is like. And so as far as like challenging that, I think you can create a safe space within your own classroom, and that does really help. But I'm really interested in how other people think about challenging that beyond the space that you can control, and encouraging that spirit of risk-taking and thinking outside of just regurgitation. Yeah, that's something I'd really love to hear other people's thoughts on, because I want to learn.
I think I try to shy away from like siloed thinking, or it's like so much of the barriers I've like run into as a writer is people saying I can't write about something because I don't have specialized knowledge. But some of the best writing I've read, even if it's just something as simple as a digression, like I had a conversation with the writer and filmmaker Blair McClendon about how he was writing this thing about Margot Jefferson, and there's this aside about a 50-cent billboard and how that somehow ties into how like the black upper class kind of uses the idea of like the folk, or like, you know, because all the culture comes from like working class like blacks, right? And so like the way that like upper middle class like blacks kind of traffic in that, but then like also dismiss it as like ignorant. And we were just talking about how like it blew his mind that his editor let him do that. And I was like telling him the story of how when I wrote about Frederick Seidel for another magazine, I just had a digression about the film Unforgiven, which doesn't make any sense in context, but they just let me write it and then just let me draw it through. And so I think creating a more porous sense of like genres and a more porous sense of discipline within writing, and just letting people make the connections that aren't necessarily the connections that like someone who exclusively writes about film or exclusively writes about music or whatever would make, to just kind of see it all the same and just take for granted that we're all just thinking about culture and not just thinking about these sort of specialized disciplines.
I would say it is a really hard task when you say like, you know, how to sort of inspire young students to think about risk. Because they do have their own understanding of what counts as risk. They have their own understanding of what is good aesthetics and what is not, especially in creative writing classrooms. Literally the high art that we bring to the class, the students think that's shit. So it's like, this is no good. The students bring their work. I'm not going to name names here, and me as an instructor thinking, this is bullshit. This class needs to end right now. We cannot meet eye to eye and ever get somewhere into creating any kind of art. So there is, I want to, my understanding is that, you know, I, for myself as an instructor, has to be more humble about understanding the idea of what counts as risk. It is an incredibly relative idea. Just like excess, what counts as excess? What counts as deviation from the norm? It's a mind-blowingly relative and slippery idea. Students have their own idea of what is norm. And so for me to accept that and see that and, you know, come to their level of understanding, I feel like as an instructor has its own inherent risk in it, and I feel like that needs to be embraced. And when that happens, I feel like there are small risks that kind of tend to happen in a way, and I feel like that can be a good starting point. And sometimes pointing students to young writers to those small risks that they're taking, which in the larger scheme of things might not seem much at all, might seem like baby steps, but I feel like acknowledging those baby steps and pointing out why those baby steps are important, and at least seeing their own rationale behind why they think that is risk-taking, I feel like is a good starting point for that conversation and dialogue and helping them become better risk-taker down the road. I have a question. Yeah. So, Justin, do you mind sort of elaborating on sort of helping us think through how, in an institutional setting, the comfort factor that the institutional settings tends to give us, be as writers, be as instructors, to not take risks, to keep doing what we keep doing, which is that is lucrative, that doesn't sort of stir the pot, which makes everybody happy. How do you sort of wrestle against that? How you sort of stir the pot and get things moving in direction? What's sort of risk in that? Could you, because the three sort of strategies that you outlined, it's like so interesting. Can you sort of help us think through, like, what are some of sort of damaging sort of risks that we could be taking by taking on the institutions?
Well, I got my MFA at a SAIC, which in the creative writing community is like a really weird place to get an MFA. Like, there's no English department, and you have like this apprentice model where like you have advisors like talking to you about stuff. And what I found, which is like crazy, was that most professors didn't really want to talk about like the business side of it, like how this is going to make sense, because that's not what this school is, we're just what it works on the page. But then if you were lucky, your advisors would like give you some game on the side. And so it's like there's people that might never get that, and so there's this kind of a baked in hierarchy to that, where if your professors like you enough, they'll give you some game, or if they think you can make it, quote unquote, they'll give you some game, but who are they to decide? And so what I've tried to do now that I teach is to kind of structure classes around that and just kind of decentralize that and just tell people like my vulnerabilities. Like, one of the things that I teach is pitching, and I show students like real emails that I've sent, like good ones, bad ones, like we talk about like how much they offer and like how to counter pitch. And then also and people go crazy because you're not supposed to show people's emails, you're not supposed to talk about money, but just like showing people that this is like a real like cause and effect, like this might lead to this or this might lead to that. Like, I think students really appreciate the transparency. So maybe that's it, Shailene. That's a really good question, but I think a lot of like, because you talked about making yourself taking risks as an instructor, and I think part of it is making yourself vulnerable and letting students know that you're not that far away from where they are, which is true. Like, I've been out of MFA for like less than 5 years, you know?
Yeah.
It's not that far away.
Yeah, I agree so much. Like, I feel like we all are sort of wrestling against institution at one level or another. So like students then see that, I'm not different from them in that radical way.
In that way, actually, one of my favorite things to do is read my students some of my bad high school poetry, which is so bad. They really enjoy it, but I don't enjoy it that much. Anyway.
Follow up on that. So, Pastor says that sometimes adjunct, and also some of the people operating out of this pseudo-collective, weirdo DIY space. What are your thoughts on education and risk-taking outside of the institution, and how that changes the ability to take risks or the disorganization of it?
That's actually so that's something that I'm going to dive into pretty firmly coming up soon. I'm actually taking a big risk and leaving a tenured position to join my partner in North Carolina, which is very scary. But one of the things I'm thinking is am I going to have another creative writing position again, or are there other ways where I can engage in this, teaching and mentoring of young writers in a non-academic setting? And I've done that in unofficial capacities as part of recruitment efforts. Like we have a creative writing BA program at this very tiny school in rural Iowa called Waldorf University. And I have reached out to a number of high school students whose writing I've seen in like high school journals and started this correspondence and kind of have this back and forth of like, oh, this poem's really cool, send me more stuff. And those have been really fulfilling moments for me, and kind of seeing their writing grow and seeing like, oh, they just got into this really cool college, like way to go. And I think that's something that I want to do, but ultimately, what I think for me is going to drive that is think about what are the long-term goals, and in any case, across educations, what are your long-term goals, and what are the short-term needs, right? So thinking back to my MFA experience, I was working on this homophonic translation, but the pieces that I was submitting for workshop were not that. Because I wanted to get like not a bad grade in the class, you know, I get to be in an MFA program, it's embarrassing. So thinking about, okay, here's what you want to do. This is really cool. This is a really cool idea. Do what you can do as well as you can, and also understand that like if you're submitting something for a grade, you kind of have to think about that as well and be like, okay, what's a safer piece sometimes? If you're in that convention, especially if you're, let's say, going into, you're sending materials to be accepted for, I don't know, a BFA creative writing program. Send the pieces that you really love, and send the ones that you feel safe to kind of anchor you to a space where you're like, okay, I feel confident in this. So they can know who you are, but also know what you can do in more conventional ways. So I think that's going to be something I'm going to be navigating quite a bit here soon. But those are generally my guiding principles, I think.
I have a weird response to that. I think it's interesting to ask that. Do you teach the same course or medium inside of the institution and outside of the institution?
No, I'm like, well, actually, no, totally not. Outside of the institution, I mentor people in publishing. Inside the institution, I teach history.
Oh, very cool. Very intimidating. I was hoping you were a visual artist, and then I would have something to talk to you about, but that's okay. But I think we're talking about. You're asking that question, I think, when higher ed is kind of like, we're seeing it crumble around us. And so I think it's really interesting to ask like what risk-taking means within like academia, which like I think we are most familiar with, and what it means outside of that, which I teach community classes sometimes, like at like local art galleries, or like to kids sometimes too, at community things. And I think one thing that we haven't touched on that I think is really interesting, well, maybe we haven't, I'm a little stressed, but like thinking about the ways in which like risk also like I think relies on an understanding of convention, right? Like, and so I think like when you think about like obviously it's easier to make mistakes and be messy and frizzle shit up in like an outside setting, but then when you're inside, but then you don't always necessarily have like you know, you didn't take your color classes, or you like don't have like, you don't know how to clean your brushes, and that's like a totally different story. Whereas like if you're inside an institution, you're able to like kind of dismantle hierarchy because you understand what hierarchy is. And so it's really different and interesting, and I think that's so cool to think about. I don't know. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Are you talking about hierarchy as far as like aesthetic, Sam, or like hierarchy of like the structure of the place?
Is there a difference? I don't know.
I mean, well, not necessarily, but
If you think there is, I'm sure there is, and I want to hear your thoughts.
No, I just ask it because, at least if you're getting like a master's, that's like a 2, maybe like 3-year program, and oftentimes I've saw people try to like make the institution like more fair, equitable in a way that was very noble, but that was distracting from their work. And so if we're just talking about risk, it's like, what does it mean to try to change the institution, and then you might be successful, and then you leave with like underdeveloped work, hypothetically, or vice versa, where you're so focused on your work that you just like shrug your shoulders at like injustice within the space. That's what I started spinning when you said that. I don't have an answer, I'm just making conversation.
No, I wanna hear someone else's response to that, actually, because I
actually don't have that. Like that question is so cool. Like, not because that got me thinking, I'm really institutionalized at this point. I really cannot even think of risk taking outside of the context of an institution, of an academic institution. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I'm listening. This is great, though.
Are there perhaps any other questions from the audience that people would like to ask the panel? Yeah.
Just a follow-up, please, Sam, just in terms of like continuing that same line of thinking, how do you see, you talked about this a little bit, how do you see the organizing and the writing practice dovetailing?
Yeah, I mean, like, well, I don't, yeah, I mean, is there any separation between, like, the lives we live and the writing that we do? I don't think so, right? Yeah, I don't know if you, I mean, like, well, I'm literally writing about the strike line that I was just on right now, actually. But I think as far as, it's really helped, it's really easy, this is something we keep returning to, and it's kind of, maybe it's a boring answer to your question, but I think it's really easy to want to, like, bow to authority when you're working in fiction, or, like, I think poets are really cool because, right, because you guys can't get agents, you can't make money, like, you're fucked. But, like, if you, like, work in a writing field where, like, you could potentially have some kind of income or some kind of stability, it's really easy to want to craft in that way. And I think something that's really exciting about, I've been helping out with a grad student strike at Temple University, and they received a temporary agreement several weeks ago that did not meet some of their basic demands, such as dependent health care. And they totally could have taken that TA, and they totally could have gone back to work, and they really fucked shit up. And they're getting dependent health care. And, like, I don't know, like, yeah, it does help me in my writing practice, subject material wise, but also, like, thinking about, like, what I am capable of as a writer. And I am not just capable of what the powers that be tell me is good. I am capable of really existential shit and real cool shit. I don't know, I feel. If that's an okay answer. Was I repeating myself? Okay. Thank you for asking that.
Any other questions?
Guys, it's stressful, but I'm here because I executive for both the represented. I'm in the NEA. I'm an editor, and I work at HarperCollins. And so it's my job to say, hey, this is no risk. So I'm working right now with really looking at the writers like writers can't publish anything. And I'm trying to go really away from it. And the amount of risk that the author is taking on is not in the balance. So, like, you could pay Philip Roth Jr. $750,000 based on 4 pages and, like, a bunch of buzz. So we have an actual human person whose life is in danger, who only needs money for rent and food and things that we can totally pay for like a 5-figure advance. And I'm looking to drive up competitive interest to try to increase the possibility that capitalism will, like, find a place for this overwhelming, like, community all of those writers. So that's okay. All along, I'm constantly trying to figure out how to make the writer's risk part of what we do at Borders. Like, all of us are at risk. Like, we just had all of our younger editors on strike.
I'm like a recovering formalist. Like I love like the old, like new critics and like these Southern like English like jerks who are like really smart at like breaking down writing, and eventually just like there's no like value to this, or like there's value to it, but it's almost as if it doesn't really help you understand where the book is in the world. And so, but when I started teaching journalism, what I found was that you're showing students like what this is and like why this is good, and just like looking at like 4 or 5 profiles in isolation, or looking at like 4 or 5 essays in isolation, and just like breaking down like why this is like marquee for what it is, was just like super helpful in getting students to like, number one, know what was possible, and then also like, oh, okay, because the other thing I do is I don't really like to teach anything like over like 10-ish years old, like being that if you can't find anything that's good and new, like that's on the instructor, that's not on the students. And so on the one hand, it's showing students what's possible, like you can actually do this in real time, but it's also like, hey, this is what like editors are like looking for, like this kind of thing, and you can do it if you can just maybe steal a little bit of like structural or like subject knowledge from this and see if you can get it out, which is not really, again, it's not necessarily like a guarantee like you're saying, but I think just like looking at works in isolation that are contemporary, I think can help a lot in understanding like what like the market is doing, which is like probably gonna be different tomorrow. You know, you can never really tell like what the market is gonna look like, but you can kind of get a general picture, which I'm sure makes sense to you as an editor.
Kind of with that, actually. So in my hybrid forms class that I mentioned, I showed some model texts. One of them was by Alejandro Zambra, and it's a book called Multiple Choice that's written as a multiple choice exam. Wouldn't have been published if it weren't him. But because he had this clout as this big Chilean novelist, he got this really weird book published. Jonathan Safran Foer, about a decade ago, had a book called Tree of Codes come out. Similar thing. You get something weird if you have the clout. And then we contrast this in the book in the class I taught with Teresa Hakim Shah's Dictee, which was very small publication, and it didn't kind of rise to prominence until after her death through academia and people teaching it and becoming kind of a cult classic. And so what I told my students is, you can't control what is or isn't going to be published, but you can do what you want to do really well. And that's kind of all I felt I could guide them toward, is here's model text, these were successful, think about the context with which they were successful, and do what you want to do and hope that someone finds it and it works out in the end. And if not, there's other ways to feed yourself too. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that just makes me think about when we were just thinking about artist youth and doing like workshops for individual art, with this writer who you're trying to like bring up, and I'm just so interested in like we who have a privilege or risk is we still have take, so we can take risks because the margin is still like we can fall back in. And so then I'm interested in like I'm just such a believer in this author, like whoever it is, like I just love because like if who says convention is not
so I don't have an MFA. I have actually an MBA, which can be kind of comical in my world. But actually, what that means is that I understand marketing and I understand how to position things and how to talk about things. And one of the things we learned in business school is the idea of a systemic risk. And so, like, a systemic risk means that you would take a chance on something that would potentially destroy the entire entity. And so, like, what's a systemic risk for HarperCollins, right? Is $175 a systemic risk? No, right? No. But it's positioned that way, you know? And as someone like me, I don't have anybody who's Bulgarian who's an agent who can who I can talk to. I don't have editors who are with a Bulgarian background who I can sort of talk to. And so it's just like, well, so, you know, the people who hold the money and the people whose cultural priorities are reflected in the market, it's like, well, what do they look like? You know, what do they, like, that needs to shift a little bit, and I think it is, because you have to have some kind of representation, and otherwise it's, you know, echo chamber.
I think we have another question.
Use the detour, but I find myself wanting a collection of like case studies of risk and like the context in which they happened and what the patterns are, what patterns exist between relationships between like financial risk and aesthetic risk. But that desire also has me on the sidetrack of thinking about like when we think about risk or like a canon of risk, we're thinking in mainly through risks which were deemed success by whatever system of evaluation we're using. So like what has happened to all the risks that are not documented or were deemed failures or things like that, and what patterns exist there too.
Please work on that.
Any final questions? Well, thank you all very much, and thank you again to Common Area Maintenance for hosting, and I hope you have a good rest of your AWP.
Hey, before you guys head out, just so you know, this space is open. We're having another event here at 6:37. Grab a drink, peruse the books, grab a book, buy a book, support local artists. The next event is a poetry reading with Kelsey Street Press, the University of Washington Bothell Poetry Program, the Bellingham Review, the whole series of prizes. Yeah.
Yes. I can turn the left, right?